March 6, 2026. Iran's Revolutionary Guard released footage of a training exercise near Bandar Abbas. Drones swarming a mock airfield painted to resemble a forward American base somewhere in the Gulf region. Their message was deliberate, calculated, and broadcast to the world. We can see your bases. We can reach them from multiple vectors. Our drone swarms and ballistic missiles will overwhelm your defenses before your aircraft ever leave the tarmac. There's just one problem with that entire strategy. The United States Air Force flew something over Iranian airspace that shouldn't exist yet, and Iran's entire defensive doctrine, every radar installation, every air defense battery, every hardened bunker they spent 3 decades building into the mountains of Fordow and Natanz, suddenly became a liability instead of an asset. Let's look at what actually happened when Iran's propaganda met American aerospace dominance in the early hours of March 6, 2026, and why the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber just made every military strategist on Earth rewrite their threat assessments from scratch. It started at 020 local time, more than 5 hours before Tehran's morning prayers echo across the city's minarets. 2 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers departed from an undisclosed forward staging location, a detail that itself deserves pause. The B-2 can reach virtually any point on Earth within hours from its permanent home at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, but the Air Force had pre-positioned assets at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean months earlier, rotating crews quietly, moving munitions under the cover of routine logistics flights that Iranian satellite surveillance and human intelligence networks cataloged as non-threatening resupply operations. Iranian intelligence analysts had watched those flights for 6 months and seen exactly what they were supposed to see: fuel, spare parts, standard maintenance rotations. The analysts were correct about every detail they observed and catastrophically wrong about everything those details added up to. Each B-2 in that formation carried a loadout that represents the most concentrated conventional strike package ever assembled in a single aircraft bay. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, known internally as the EMOP, is a 30,000-pound bunker-busting bomb designed for a single purpose that engineers spent 15 years perfecting. It was built specifically to defeat deeply buried, hardened underground facilities, the kind Iran spent 40 years constructing beneath granite mountains, because Iran's military planners understood correctly that nothing else in the American conventional arsenal could touch them. Fordow sits under 260 feet of solid rock. Iranian engineers considered that a permanent guarantee. They considered that geography the one variable that American aerospace power could never overcome. They were working from an outdated threat model, one in which the MOP did not yet exist in sufficient reliability, sufficient accuracy, or sufficient quantity to matter. As of 020 on March 6, 2026, every one of those assumptions died quietly somewhere over the Persian Gulf. The B-2 is not a fast aircraft. It cruises at roughly 560 miles per hour, which sounds underwhelming until you understand what that speed is paired with. The Spirit's radar cross-section is famously described as roughly equivalent to a large bird, a golf ball in some frequency ranges, and while that comparison is technically imprecise, it captures the essential reality. Iranian air defense networks operating on conventional radar frequencies simply do not see it. The Qadam al-Anbaya Air Defense Base, the nerve center of Iran's integrated air defense system, had been tracking commercial air traffic, monitoring American carrier strike group movements in the Gulf, and cataloging activity at regional air bases throughout the night. Their radar operators were professional, experienced, and completely blind to the 2 aircraft drawing a slow, deliberate line toward Iran's most sensitive nuclear infrastructure. The planes were there. The radars were running. The gap between those 2 facts is where American aerospace dominance lies. Iran's air defense system is not simple. It would be a strategic mistake and a factual error to describe it that way, and understanding what the B-2 flew through matters more than simply celebrating that it did. Iran operates Russian-supplied S-300 PMU-2 batteries, domestically produced Bavar's Sin-3 systems that Iranian engineers reverse-engineered and modified over years of sanctioned necessity, and a network of early warning radars, fighter interceptors, and surface-to-air missile installations that, against any conventional aircraft, would present a genuinely lethal environment. Against a 4th-generation fighter like an F-15 or an F-16, penetrating Iranian airspace at low altitude to reach Fordow would require an extensive suppression of enemy air defenses campaign, electronic warfare support, decoy packages, and significant risk. Iranian defense planners built their entire deterrence model around that calculus. They made the math difficult enough that the political cost of an American strike would outweigh the military benefit. It was a sound strategy. It worked for decades. The B-2 does not solve that equation by brute force. It invalidates the equation entirely by refusing to be seen. At 0247, the lead aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace over the Makran coast. There were no electronic warfare alerts in Qadam al-Anbaya. There were no intercept orders scrambled to Shahraki Air Base, where Iran's most capable fighter pilots sit on rotating alert. There was nothing on any display in any Iranian command post to indicate that the most capable strike aircraft ever built was at that moment flying a direct course toward the most protected piece of real estate in the Islamic Republic. The B-2 flew in radio silence, navigating via GPS and inertial systems that have been hardened against the kind of jamming Iran's electronic warfare units routinely practice. Iranian EW operators had been running interference patterns all night against American surveillance assets operating near the Gulf. They were jamming the wrong frequencies, targeting the wrong signatures, defending against a threat profile that the aircraft overhead didn't match in any measurable way. What happened at Fordow at 0319 will be studied in military academies for the next 50 years. The GBU-57 is guided by a combination of GPS and an internal navigation system that corrects for GPS jamming or signal degradation in the terminal phase. It enters the ground at a carefully calculated angle, uses a hardened casing and a delayed fuse to drive deeper before detonation, and delivers its explosive at a depth that engineers determined was necessary to compromise reinforced concrete structures built to survive near-miss nuclear detonations. Iran built Fordow to survive anything short of a nuclear strike. The GBU-57 was designed after Fordow. That sequencing is not coincidental. The Air Force watched Iran bury that facility, calculated the depth, the geology, the reinforcement specifications drawn from intelligence sources that included defectors, satellite imagery, and seismic monitoring, and then built a weapon precisely calibrated to reach it. 2 MOPs in sequence delivery, the second arriving before the crater from the first has fully stabilized, driving deeper along the channel the first when opened. The facility at Fordow had been Iran's nuclear insurance policy. At 0319 it became a very expensive hole. Natanz, 11 minutes later. The above-ground portions of Natanz had been struck before, in previous operations that set back Iran's enrichment timeline, but failed to reach the deeply buried centrifuge halls that Iranian engineers had moved underground after the 2010 Stuxnet attack, clear that surface facilities were vulnerable. Iranian planners had drawn what they believed was a clear lesson from that period. Go deeper, go harder, go more reinforced, and no conventional weapon would ever reach the centrifuges again. They were not wrong about the need to go deeper. They were catastrophically wrong about how deep was deep enough. The second two put 2 MOPs into the underground centrifuge halls at Natanz with an accuracy that GPS-guided weapons at that weight class were not supposed to achieve 5 years ago. The circular error probable, the radius within which 50% of rounds land, was under 3 meters. At 30,000 pounds per weapon, 3 meters of accuracy is the difference between a near miss and a facility that no longer exists in any functional sense. Iranian air defense operators at 33331 began receiving reports from seismic monitoring stations in the region, the same stations Iran uses to detect nuclear tests. They were detecting explosions of enormous magnitude at 2 of their most sensitive sites, and they still had nothing on radar. No aircraft tracks, no incoming ballistic missiles, no cruise missile signatures. The seismic data was real. The facilities were destroyed, and the sky, as far as every sensor Iran possessed could determine, was completely empty. The psychological dimension of that gap, knowing thing had struck you with devastating precision and being unable to identify what it was, where it came from, or whether it was still overhead, is not a secondary effect of B-2 operations. It is a primary feature. Deterrence is not just about physical destruction. It is about communicating capability in a way that makes an adversary reassess every assumption they have built their defense strategy upon. Iran spent the next 4 hours reassessing. At 0400, Iranian Supreme National Security Council members were being woken by secure phone calls in Tehran. The Revolutionary Guard Aerospace Division was running diagnostics on every radar in the integrated air defense network. Look for the technical failure that must have caused their systems to miss whatever had just destroyed Fordow and Natanz. They would spend the next 12 hours looking for that failure. They would not find it because it was not a failure. The radars worked exactly as designed. The B-2 worked exactly as designed. The encounter between those two facts has only one outcome. The 2 B-2s egressed Iranian airspace along a different route than their ingress, crossing the border near Sistan-Baluchistan province and turning south toward the Arabian Sea. By 0430, both aircraft were outside Iranian airspace and had made brief encrypted communications contact with command, confirming successful weapons release and aircraft integrity. The crews had been airborne for nearly 5 hours and had another 4 hours of flight ahead of them. This is routine B-2 operations. The crews fly with in-flight refueling capability, the second seat providing mission crew redundancy, and with life support systems designed for the kind of extended missions that would reduce a conventional aircraft crew to exhaustion long before the target complex. American aerospace dominance is not just about the airframe or the weapons. It is about the logistics and training infrastructure that makes sustained, long-range precision strike a repeatable, reliable operational capability rather than a one-time demonstration. By 0600, as Tehran began waking up to the news, Iranian state media had gone conspicuously quiet about 2 topics simultaneously. There were no announcements about Fordow. There were no announcements about Natanz. The silence was its own kind of broadcast. Iran's information environment under the Revolutionary Guard operates on a doctrine of aggressive counter-messaging, flooding the media space with claims of victory, American aggression, Zionist conspiracy, and resistance narrative within hours of any adverse event. The silence meant the event was too large, too undeniable, and too damaging to the deterrence narrative that Iran had spent 30 years building for any counter-messaging to survive contact with satellite imagery that would be available to the international community within hours. Tehran was calculating, not celebrating. The B-2's mission on March 6 did not happen in isolation, and understanding it requires understanding the architecture of American power projection that makes two aircraft doing something that fundamentally feel almost routine. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group was operating in the northern Arabian Sea, close enough to Iranian coastal radar coverage that its presence was fully tracked and widely reported. Iranian state media had in fact run a story 2 days earlier highlighting the carrier group's position as evidence that American belligerents posed a regional threat. That narrative was partly true and entirely misdirected. The carrier group's visibility was not a vulnerability, it was a feature. While Iranian air defense attention was distributed across Gulf approaches, fighter intercept corridors that Iranian doctrine calculates for carrier-based aircraft, and the political messaging task of demonstrating awareness of the Abraham Lincoln's position, two aircraft flying from the south attracted no attention at all. The carrier group was the headline. The B-2 was the story. American electronic warfare aircraft operating from bases in the Gulf region had been running what appeared to Iranian monitoring as routine signals intelligence collection operations throughout the night. EA-18G Growlers from the carrier air wing had conducted a pattern of electronic emissions that Iranian intercept operators logged, analyzed, and assessed as surveillance activity. Those Growlers were also, simultaneously, mapping the precise operating frequencies, pulse rates, and coverage gaps of every Iranian air defense radar that activated to track them. The data from that mapping updated the B-2 mission's threat avoidance planning in near real time, feeding into a route that not only avoided radar coverage geometrically, but specifically threaded the timing gaps in Iran's radar rotation cycles. This is cooperative electronic warfare at its most sophisticated, two entirely different aircraft types working a problem from opposite angles simultaneously. Iran was watching the Growlers carefully and never knew the Growlers were watching back with a specific purpose in mind. The deeper consequence of what happened on March 6, 2026 is not the physical destruction of Fordow and Natanz, as significant as that physical destruction is. The deeper consequence is what it communicates about the permanence of American aerospace dominance across the full spectrum of conventional military operations. Iran's deterrence strategy against an American strike was built on 4 pillars, each of which has now been compromised in ways that cannot be repaired by buying more weapons, digging deeper, or building more drones. The first pillar was depth, the idea that burying facilities under enough rock made them immune to conventional attack. The GBU-57 destroyed that pillar at 0319. The second pillar was detection, the idea that an incoming strike would be visible enough to trigger defensive response, political escalation, and international intervention before it reached its targets. The B-2's radar cross-section destroyed that pillar across the entire 5 hours of the mission. The third pillar was cost and position, the idea that attacking Iran would be expensive enough in aircraft, pilots, international political capital that American decision-makers would hesitate. The loss of 0 aircraft and 0 crew on a mission that destroyed Iran's most protected nuclear facilities destroyed that pillar in a single night. The fourth pillar was the drone and missile swarm strategy Iran spent decades developing, designed to overwhelm American defenses through volume and cost asymmetry. That pillar was destroyed not on March 6, but in the weeks prior when American directed energy systems demonstrated during exercises exactly the kind of cost-per-kill ratio that makes Iran's asymmetric strategy economically unsustainable at the scale required to threaten American power projection platforms. Iranian defense spending over the past 20 years made strategic sense within the threat model Iran's planners were working from. They correctly identified that they could not match American conventional military power in a straight exchange of capabilities. They correctly concluded that asymmetric approaches, drone swarms, anti-ship missiles, proxy forces, and deeply buried hardened facilities could raise the cost of American action high enough to provide effective deterrence. They built those capabilities competently at significant expense, with genuine engineering ingenuity in areas where sanctions prevented purchasing off-the-shelf solutions. They built a deterrence architecture that would have worked very well against the American military of 15 years ago. The problem is that American military technology did not stand still while Iran was building that architecture. The B-2 fleet was modernized, the GBU-57 was refined, and its reliability improved to the point where 2 aircraft carrying 2 weapons each confidently plan to destroy facilities that previously required strike packages of dozens of aircraft with with significant risk to crews and platforms. Directed energy weapons, matured from laboratory prototypes to deployed operational systems in a development timeline that Iranian intelligence consistently estimated was 5 to 8 years further out than reality. The gap between where Iran's threat model thought American capabilities were and where American capabilities actually arrived on March 6 was the gap that determined the outcome. The crews of those two B-2s landed at their forward staging location at approximately 07:20 local time. They had been airborne for roughly 7 hours and 20 minutes. By any external measure, they looked like any other crew returning from a long training mission, tired, focused on flight checks, going through the debrief protocols that are the same regardless of whether the mission was a training exercise over the Nevada desert or a precision strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The professionalism of those crews reflects an institutional culture built over decades at the 5th Bomb Wing, the same unit that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the same unit that flew the first operational B-2 missions over Serbia in 1999, the same that has maintained nuclear certified capability through every shift in the international threat environment since the end of the Cold War. The 509th does not produce excitable pilots. It produces professionals who fly the most demanding missions in the American military inventory as a matter of routine competence, because the alternative, treating those missions as exceptional, is incompatible with the reliability that nuclear deterrence and precision conventional strike both require. Back in Tehran, the Revolutionary Guard's public response, when it finally came 12 hours after the strikes, was a masterclass in communicating weakness through the language of strength. State media reported heroic resistance, American aggression, the steadfastness of the Islamic Republic, and the ultimate futility of Zionist American plots against the Iranian people. None of those statements addressed the seismic readings, none addressed the satellite imagery that international monitoring agencies were already distributing. None addressed the fundamental question that every Iranian military planner was asking behind closed doors. If they could reach Fordow without being detected, what else can they reach, and when to decide to stop warning us before they did it? That question has no reassuring answer within Iran's current military posture. The B-2 does not negotiate. It does not send diplomatic signals that can be interpreted or reinterpreted. It arrives or it does not, and on March 6, 2026, it arrived without a single alarm sounding until the ground. The international response unfolded along predictable lines that themselves reveal the depth of American dominance in the current strategic environment. American allies in the region made public statements noting Iran's continued violations of non-proliferation agreements while calling for diplomatic solutions. Adversaries made predictable condemnations. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session that produced the kind of resolution that Security Council emergency sessions produce. None of that diplomatic activity changed the physical reality on the ground in Fordow and Natanz, and every government represented in that chamber understood that the physical reality was the point. Words at the UN do not rebuild underground centrifuge halls. Satellite imagery does not rebuild underground centrifuge halls. The only thing that rebuilds underground centrifuge halls is time, resources, political will, and confidence that the rebuilt facility will be more survivable than the destroyed one. Given what March 6 demonstrated about American strike capability, that confidence is extraordinarily difficult to maintain. The B-2 Spirit entered service in 1997 and cost approximately $2 billion per aircraft. In the years following its introduction, critics questioned whether numbers of that cost and capability were relevant to the threat environment of the post-Cold War world, whether precision conventional strike could achieve strategic objectives without nuclear weapons, and whether the investment made sense when cheaper alternatives might accomplish similar results. March 6, 2026 provided a definitive answer to those questions. Two aircraft, 0 losses. Two facilities that represented the core of Iran's nuclear deterrence eliminated under 30 minutes of weapons delivery. No fighter cover required because no intercept was possible. No suppression of enemy air defenses required because the enemy air defenses could not detect what they needed to suppress. No extended air campaign. No ground forces. No occupation. No protracted conflict that bleeds American political will over years. Two aircraft doing exactly what they were designed and built and maintained and crewed to do, against a target that represented the hardest conventional strike problem in the current threat environment. That is what $2 billion per aircraft buys. That is what American aerospace dominance looks like when it is applied with precision and competence against a well-defended, deeply hardened target by professionals who have spent careers preparing for exactly this mission. Iran's military doctrine will have to be rebuilt from principles that do not yet exist, because the principles it was built on have been empirically falsified. The assumption that depth defeats conventional weapons is gone. The assumption that stealth platforms can be detected by layered air defense networks if those networks are sophisticated enough is gone. The assumption that that cost asymmetry favors the defending party when the attacking party can project precision. Conventional strike from undetectable platforms is gone. What remains for Iranian strategic planners is a difficult conversation about whether military deterrence against American power is achievable through any conventional means currently within Iran's technical and economic reach, or whether the deterrence equation has moved to a domain where Iran's resources and technical capacity are simply not competitive. That is not a comfortable conversation. It is, however, the accurate one that March 6, 2026 forced onto the agenda. The United States has not commented officially on the specific operational details of the mission, as is standard practice for sensitive strike operations. The silence from Washington is its own message, delivered in a register that Iranian intelligence analysts understand fluently. There is no triumphalism in the official American posture, because triumphalism would require explanation, and explanation would open conversations about precedent, international law, and escalation management that serve no American strategic interest in the current moment. The mission happened. The facilities are destroyed. The B-2s are back at their staging location. The crews are debriefed. The weapons are being rearmed. The message is complete. Iran received it at 0319 when the ground shook under 260 feet of granite, and every subsequent communication from Washington is simply allowing Tehran to absorb the implications fully before the next decision point arrives. There is one more dimension of March 6th that deserves examination, because it speaks to the difference between a military capability and a military strategy. Destroying Fordow and Natanz is not an end state. It is a data point in a longer competition between American strategic patience and Iranian strategic ambition. Iran will attempt to rebuild. It has done so before. After Stuxnet, after previous strikes, after sanctions regimes that crippled its economy and isolated its engineers from the international research community, Iran found ways to continue its nuclear program, because the program represents something beyond its technical output. It represents Iranian sovereignty, Iranian defiance, Iranian insistence on being treated as a major power in a regional order that Tehran believes has historically denied it that status. American policymakers understand this, or should. The B-2 mission destroyed facilities. It did not destroy the will that built them, and will without facilities can rebuild facilities given enough time. The question that follows March 6 is not whether the mission succeeded. It did. The question is what success at this level of capability demonstration changes about the calculations on both sides for the months and years ahead. This is what American dominance looks like in the third decade of the 21st century. It does not look like carrier battle groups steaming toward a conflict in a show of force designed to communicate resolve through visibility. Those capabilities remain, and remain formidable. But the definitive expression of American military power in this era, two aircraft that cannot be seen, carrying weapons that cannot be stopped, flown by crews who have their entire careers for missions exactly like this one, reaching targets that an adversary spent 40 years convincing themselves were safe. B-2 bombers just did something huge. Iran cannot stop it. That is not a boast. It is a description of the current operational reality, and it will remain the operational reality for as long as American aerospace investment, training culture, and strategic clarity continue to produce capabilities that stay a generation ahead of the threat models adversaries build their defenses around.